Today on the show, we bring you a conversation with Dr. Dan Greenstein, Director of Education, Postsecondary Success in the United States program for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Dan is going to talk about how to engage in a conversation with your colleagues around, one, how do we address the significant gaps in our workforce development needs as we head toward 2025? Second, what is the role in seeking business efficiencies in building a sustainable institutional future? And most importantly, are we doing enough to be genuinely disruptive?
The conversation runs about 42 minutes, so go grab a cup of coffee and enjoy the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Navigating Change, the podcast from Tybal Education. I'm Pete Wright, and I'm here, as always, with Howard Tybal. You said something to me a few days ago, Howard, about provoking the avalanche, and that has really stuck with me. I hope we will provoke a little avalanche today. We have a guest that is uniquely equipped to help us dive into some of these questions. Dr. Daniel Greenstein serves as Director of Education, Postsecondary Success in the United States program for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In that capacity, he oversees work to substantially increase the number of students who acquire a post-secondary degree or certificate. He comes to that role from the University of California Office of the President as Vice Provost for Academic Planning and Programs, overseeing academic planning required for the 10-campus, 220,000-student UC system. Dan Greenstein, welcome to Navigating Change.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Dan, is provoking the avalanche too provoking? What do you think about that metaphor?
Look, I think the snow is piling up pretty high on top of some of these cornices. So
there's something about getting ahead of this, thinking about what we do as we look forward as navigators of change, as opposed to solvers of change. And if you think about yourself as a navigator, the mindset is you need to know that those things are coming and you need to have the resiliency to deal with them. So I'm curious if in the nature of your engaging with others, whether you see that metaphor showing up and if you find it useful.
I do. I mean, I think I do. I think it's a great framing. Look, change is constant and the pace of change is probably accelerating. And so I think it's appropriate to constantly be looking forward and course correcting, fast fail, rapid prototyping, the kind of trends you see in many different sectors of our economy, including service sectors. The only caveat, I guess, the only add I would make is that, you know, the institutions which are moving very progressively in innovative ways to better serve their students, to graduate more students, and to do better with what we call the new majority students who are part-time, students of color, low-income students, increasingly students who are over the age of 24, improving their graduation rates. The institutions which are doing the best, they do have a long-term vision of themselves and their value and the communities and the students that they serve, and they hold those fast, you know, as a North Star, a Southern Cross, depending on which metaphor you prefer. And they hold those fast and they orient towards them. But as they're moving towards that long-range vision, they're constantly trying and shifting and changing, using data often in order to make course corrections. And I think of folks like who've been in the business a long time. John Hitt, who's the president of the University of Central Florida, a great innovative institution. Michael Crow's been at Arizona for 12 years. Stephen Johnson at Sinclair Community College, probably 14 years. Able to sort of orient towards that long-term vision, but constantly change and evolve in order to get there with greater effectiveness.
Right. So what I hear you saying is the caveat is that in the absence of having a steadfast, long-term view of where we're going to go and repeating that mantra, whatever it is, in the absence of that, navigating can you can end up someplace, but not where you would necessarily where you want to end up.
I think that's right. And I think it's also a check against faddishness, right? You know, there's a real, going after a group of students who are just not really feasible given the nature of the institution. It's really important to know the students and the communities that you serve, to know what the core competencies of the institution really are, to understand in a very practical, realistic, and often self-critical way both strengths and limitations, and then to sort of factor that into your thinking about how to evolve.
You shared 4 points with Pete and I in advance of this, and I want to read something that you wrote, just the intro, and I'd love you to expound on this. How do we get people to recognize it's more than just being well-meaning? You said, I don't believe that the philanthropic incentive is powerful enough or potentially powerful enough to engage effectively with the challenges in higher ed. Doing the right thing is an important motivation, but may not be strong enough to overcome the obstacles to change. Say more about that.
So let me maybe begin by just framing the scale of the change that we're trying to accomplish. So if you look at the challenge in higher education, if you look at from a crass...
Excuse me, when you say we, I just want to make sure that, because people know that you're with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Yeah.
Is the we like the mindset that you put on your work? I just think it's good for people to understand sort of the we in this case. What's the we?
I think that's a great question. Thanks for asking. I spent a long part of my life in Britain where we used to talk about the royal we. So I think in this case it would be we. The foundation works closely with any number of different partners,
right.
And I would sort of if I were to put my arms around those partners, and that includes folks who are both supportive of various forms of investments, but also thought partners, and folks who are really thinking hard about what it means to reinvigorate higher education in service to the country. So if there's if you can imagine a kind of budding higher ed reform movement, I would that's the we.
Got it.
And so when I speak about we, I'm really thinking about the folks in whose company we have the honor of traveling.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. And that's why your lens in your view, because you have a broad lens of people who are deeply trying to see how they can navigate this. So sorry for the interruption.
No, good call.
So let's get back to what this obstacles to change and this question about motivation.
So let's talk about the scale of the change first, and then let's talk about the motivation. So if you're looking at it from a purely economic lens, right, and you're saying, one role of higher education, and there are many roles, but one role, of course, is to sort of ensure that the workforce has the kind of people in it that we need to sort of continue to develop our economy. So the economists at Georgetown, Tony Carnevale and his colleagues, estimate that by 2025, the nation's workforce will require 11 million more people to have some form of post-secondary education than the country's colleges and universities are currently on track to produce. If you break that down, it's about a 4 or 5% compound annual growth rate, which means in real people's terms that every single to achieve that goal, to feed the nation's workforce development needs and our continued economic progress, colleges and universities would have every year to increase their graduation rates, degrees and certificates, by 5% a year. 5% a year, year on year. We're currently traveling at about 1%, right? And that's mostly driven by enrollment growth, which is flattening. So somehow we're going to have to increase our graduation rates by five times our current rate every single year. So that's the first. Now you could also look at this, and we do. When I say we, again, the larger sort of interest in creating, re-energizing higher education. You can also look at this through an equity lens and say, what would it take to actually diminish the appalling gaps in opportunity gaps, attainment gaps between rich and poor, black and white? So right now, if you're a wealthy person, you're 5 times more likely to have a BA by age of 24 than if you're poor. 5 times more likely. And I think it's 3 times more likely if you're white than if you're Hispanic. And you can go on in those ways. So you're looking at these massive changes that are going to have to be affected in how colleges perform with the students that they serve, with in particular low-income students of color.
Yeah.
So that's the nature of the change. We're talking about something happening at enormous scale. Now, in the public sector, in the public universities and colleges, people are motivated. They tend to teach and work there because they're motivated by the social mission of those places. And yet, you got to ask yourself, is that motivation sufficient to drive the nature of reorganization and change and innovation
across our institutions, not just within.
That's exactly right.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
What are you observing since you have been sharing this mantra now? What do you observe is coming back at you as a result of what you're sharing?
So a couple of things. One of them is the scale of the problem is vast. The nature of the changes that are required are huge. But there's also a lot of points of light on the horizon. So you can point to any number, a growing number of colleges and universities who are really moving the needle in stunning ways. And you can, and surrounding those institutions, you ask them, gosh, what are you doing that's enabling you to succeed? How is it that Georgia State University, for example, was able to double its graduation rates while it was increasing the number of Pell and low-income students? And at the same time, oh, by the way, and this is only in a period of 5 or 7 years. And by the way, eliminate attainment gaps between rich and poor, black and white. What did they do to achieve those goals? How was it that University of Central Florida was able to have a similar effect, not just to improve its graduation rates while it was diversifying its student body? How are they able to do that while they're actually containing cost and reducing expenditure per student? So if you look at there are a number of institutions which demonstrate through their existence, through the successes that they've had, that these problems can be addressed. What we're also seeing is that they're being addressed through, it's not an infinite variety of solutions that people are trying. So one of the other points of light, at least in my view, is you're beginning to see coalescence within the community around a fairly concise, finite handful of things that appear, interventions, approaches, organizational approaches, uses of technology, of a handful of interventions, call them, that actually seem to work to improve the ability of a college to help to not only enroll a greater number of more diverse students, but actually help them through to graduation. So I think that coalescence is really beginning to take shape in a handful of ways, and you're beginning to see opportunities in groups of institutions coming together to learn from one another, to network with each other, to enable those in a way that enables those innovations to actually spread and scale, which is pretty exciting.
We need to balance, when I say optimism, I don't mean cheerleading, a sense of what's possible by giving examples of where there are places, if you put the right focus, or say, here's where we're having success, we need to learn from it, but then also with the brutal facts. And it seems that's the game that we have to play well. We have to tell the brutal facts so it doesn't immobilize people into inaction. At the same time, we have to have a vision where they can see it's possible. And then the question is, how do you get people who are working within their institutions to think more broadly?
Well, I have to say, one of the things that we have seen, again, if you look at the innovators, is that there are any number of different motivations at work. One of them is that they tend to recognize that student success is actually key to their institution's financial sustainability and survival. That's powerfully apparent in the independent sector. Less so, I think, has been less apparent in the public sector, the public nonprofit sector, but it's becoming increasingly so in the public nonprofit sector. At where, again, if you look at the innovative institutions, the leadership is well aware that a 1% bump in year-on-year retention returns a certain number of dollars, and they're beginning to evaluate the various aspects of their, let's call it a student success agenda, the various initiatives that they're putting in place in order to improve their student success. They're beginning to evaluate the cost of those initiatives against the return, which is measured in terms of dollars retained. So I'll give you a concrete example. So one of the things we're seeing a real coalescence around is the use of technologies that allow you to support student advising using predictive analytics. It allows you to identify patterns in the data which suggest, for example, that a student in a major area of study who is getting a C in their first year in a course that they need for the major they're proposing, is much less likely to graduate than a student who's getting a B or above, right? And so you can begin to have advising interventions with that student much earlier on. You don't have to wait until they're 100 credits in, they're dropping out. You don't have to wait until that happens to have a conversation about, let's look at this, and we've got patterns here that we can show you, and let's have a conversation about what we can do about this. And we're seeing pretty significant, consistent retention improvements for folks who are using those technologies well. Using those technologies well typically means adding more advisors, adding to your costs on the advising side, sometimes significantly. The only way you can justify that, of course, is not just, so if it was that going back to what's the incentive structure, what are some of the powerful incentives? Well, one incentive, it's definitely the right thing to do. We have to add more advisors. We have to bring the student advisor ratio down from its 650 or 800 students per advisor. We have to get it closer to 350, 400 or whatever. That's a powerful incentive. It's the right thing to do for our students. That's a powerful incentive. The fact that it might cost $3 or $4 million, depending on the size of the institution over a period of time, is also a powerful disincentive, right? So how do you balance that? And the way I'm seeing it balance is where folks are looking at the numbers basically and saying, look, we're going to spend this money on adding, doubling our advising corps, doing whatever, adding to our advising corps. But if we're able through doing that to improve our retention rates by a certain amount, we're going to not just return on the investment, we're actually going to do better on the whole. So folks who are making those calculations, really thinking carefully about their student success agenda, marrying that philanthropic, it's the right thing to do, with it's the financially sane thing to do, is a very powerful set of incentives.
I think that was such a perfect example, and it ties nicely to the second point you were making, because in one breath, I'm out there and I was having a meeting today, and the whole conversation was with this particular institution. They were exploring how do we pursue bold ideas, and was really attempting to get their leaders to step outside of this is the way we've always done it into a conversation about what would it mean for us to really focus on the outcomes we're offering and or that we envision, and then design our structures to support that. You wrote, while seeking efficiencies is not a sustaining way to correct the basic business failure, it does buy us time and will require more use of technology. And what I really like about that is that recognizing, in one breath, you could say that incremental efficiencies is not going to get us there. But that's the first time I read or thought about this idea of we need ways to think about buying time and get people caught up with how in being part of not just the solution, but understanding the problem.
Yeah, I think there's two things. So one of them is, you're buying time. The other is you're actually freeing up investment dollars, right?
Right.
So that if you're able to sort of achieve efficiencies in one area, again, it depends on the institution. In some public institutions, the fear, and it's grounded in more than a kernel of evidence, is that any efficiency saving is swept up by the public funder in terms of a kind of further funding reduction. And that's that is a real and present threat. At the same time, one is always thinking about, can you create an efficiency somewhere so you can reallocate dollars in ways that improve student success. That's the ideal.
The challenge of that, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a small private where I'm on the faculty, it is that, when the institution tends to be struggling, it's generally because they're so focused at playing on the margins, then there is never enough time, I should say. So, your examples are so spot on. Our schools like Georgia State and Florida making such gains in graduation rates by playing on efficiencies. Where does efficiency end and boldness begin?
Yeah, and the boldness, and I've seen this in the independents, and our work tends to be with the larger publics because that's where the numbers are, quite frankly, but we do some stuff with the independents as well. I've seen it in any number of places. Often the innovation does tend to be on the margin with small discretionary dollars. It's the and that tends to be the pilot, right? Let's try this. Let's see what it looks like. Let's experiment, which is really powerful. The question is, let's come back to that. The question is, how can you actually reduce the amount of experimentation time, because it takes time and money. The real challenge is the boldness comes when you commit to scaled implementation of X, whatever X is, whatever innovation, because you can't easily dial back on that. I've seen that up close and personal in a small independent, where in many small independents where they do the typical thing. We're going to add, in order to increase our enrollments and boost our revenue, we're going to add a lacrosse team and a professional school or something, a professional program. And then you've got to basically sit back and hope to God the enrollments come in the way that you forecast them. And, that's a 3, 4, 5 year journey. And when do you pull the plug? Now, the margins aren't as small and a much larger, scale matters in this industry, which gets back to your issue of, competition between, scale matters in a variety of ways. We tend to see that larger institutions do better in their cost structure, and they can do significantly better in terms of delivery on student outcomes. Now, again, we're talking about, not talking about, well-endowed elite privates, whether of the liberal arts or research variety. We're tending to I'm speaking here about the regional comprehensives, the 2 years, and the public research, non-flagship research universities. Scale matters, and so that search for efficiency is often going to be tied up in search for scale efficiencies. And then you get to the notion of shared services and cloud services and, the kind of mergers that are going on in the Georgia state system. I mean, we're beginning to see, in the University of Texas, where they got the merger in the Rio Grande Valley, you're beginning to see a bunch of incremental approaches to achieving those kinds of scale efficiencies, not in the interest of dollars, in the interest of student success, which I think is very powerful.
There's a recognition that part of the problem about being a disruptor is that when you're in it, you don't see the incentive to change is low. You also wrote, are we doing enough to support the genuine disruptive way to move this industry forward? I'm concerned on some level, Dan, that it reminds me a bit of IBM when the mainframe business was still strong. There is no incentive until that thing fell off the face of the earth did it become of not just interest, but of critical nature to move into microcomputers and laptops.
Yeah.
And I'm concerned that the industry, as much as we're going to do, that in the absence of external disruption or maybe positive external disruption, it's going to be very hard to make some of the changes that you are struggling with every day.
Yeah, so there's a couple things, I guess, going on. One of them is, that's why I love this long-term vision. Like, where are we going in the next 10, 15, and 20 years? Because it allows you to think sort of incrementally through the kinds of changes that one needs to navigate through. The second, I think, is that there's real constraint on innovation in the fact that, it's very hard for any participant in any industry to look at the next bend in the S-curve, right? What's happening? Because as long as we're making money now, yeah, things are bad, but it could get better. There's always that. So there's a first mover problem, right? What is it that's going to get you beyond the strategy of hope that things are going to get better somehow, to actually undertake the difficult and very fundamental kinds of reforms.
To be personally invested.
Right. and comprehensively across institutions. One person can never pull these things off,
Yes.
Especially in higher education where, top down's tough call. I mean, you can do it in some places, but not many. That they need to be, in order for the kinds of transformations to be lasting and systemic in a college or university, they have to be very inclusively led, which is hard to do. And it's hard to do in an industry where leadership typically changes every 5 or 6 years. There's turnover. Are we going to face an existential crisis in my tenure as a president? Probably not. Are we going to face an existential crisis in the next 10 to 15? Maybe. Right. So that's actually another impediment, I think, with respect to disruption as well. And it's not been very effective in higher ed. The regulatory environment, not just the federal, but also the one sort of created by our accreditation systems, make it very difficult to start something funded, to make it very difficult for institutions to go away, and to make it very difficult for new institutions to emerge that are genuinely outside the mold. So I think that, while I struggle with, when I say are we supporting enough disruption, I think, or potential, when I say disruption, maybe I'm meaning potentially transformative innovation. How's that? When I say, are we supporting enough potentially transformative innovation, I think I am thinking of we investors in higher education, and that includes public investors like states and federal governments, as well as philanthropy and other commercial private providers. Are we investing in enough things that could potentially be transformative? Are we so focused on the incremental approach to innovation that we're not looking hard enough at the next smartphone or the equivalent in higher education? I think that's a constant concern.
Where are you looking as you look out in the next 6 months to a year? Where are you hoping to put your energy?
Yeah. So first of all, I look backwards, and I look back to 2006.
You're a historian.
I am. I have to. Right. I can't help myself. It's like just beaten into me. I look. If you go back to Spellings, I think was 2006. So you go back about a decade. There's been a tremendous amount of change in higher education, which is perceived as an industry which doesn't change. And I think that perception is not very helpful.
Right.
If you think about it, everybody now is talking about completion and student success. The completion wasn't known as an issue. It was just becoming known as an issue 10 years ago. It's now on everybody's lips.
And,
right?
and people now know what you say student success, that is a overarching term for a number of different things. And people are beginning to recognize what that means from an institutional standpoint.
Yeah. You could not have a conversation about the value of college with too many people in 2006. Now we are intensely focused as a community.
That's a
not
great
just
point.
Higher ed providers, students and parents. I mean, my kid's in high school, so we go to the high school, sports dinner potlucks, and they find out that I'm an educator, and so I get all the questions about the choices families are making when they're applying to college. Should I send my kid to the local public and be able to maybe help them with a graduate school? Or should I send them to the sort of non-local public or even private, and graduate schools off the table? How do we navigate financial aid? How do we navigate scholarship? Does it matter if they go to X or Y? Parents are making, and their children are making really difficult trade-off decisions. And of course, 40% of our students, I think, are actually independent. They're themselves going to college. They're over the age of 24. They're independent from their parents financially. And of course, their means are even more constrained, and their trade-offs are more, in some ways, stark. And so there is visceral experience of this sort of conversation around what's the value. I think people recognize in all the polling that we do that college is still a sustaining, is probably one of the best pathways into a sustaining career and good life. And at the same time, there's increasing skepticism that colleges and universities are returning on that promise to the students that they're enrolling, and those are disturbing trends. But it actually represents another part of the incentive structure that's at work, because those are the students that colleges are now going to have to enroll. They're becoming more skeptical, and they need to be more skeptical because the cost of college, relative to the cost to them is increasing. So I think, and I mean, we've already talked about it. You can see, other points of like coalescence around things that actually work. We've talked about advising using predictive analytics. We're beginning to see really good numbers with some kinds of online education, particularly hybrid education, where there's still a lot of face-to-face contact, but where the technology is being used to support the faculty in doing the best that they can and support the students in doing the best that they can. We're seeing good numbers there. We're seeing, excellent examples of, different approach to financial aid packaging. We're seeing good approach, better understanding of how to improve transfer from community colleges to 4 years so that students don't lose so many credits and stay on track to a degree. So you're seeing coalescence around a variety of really important innovations, and you're beginning to see those innovations spread. So to your question, what are we doing? We're beginning to invest more and more of our dollars as we're beginning to see that it's less about, oh my goodness, what do we do? We're actually getting our arms as a community around what to do to begin. Now we're beginning to think, okay, how do you actually support engagement with that knowledge? And how do you support the spread of implementations? How do you support the next college so that it can learn quickly, experiment quickly, drawing on knowledge for the community already has, understanding how it fits and works within the local context, and moving quickly to implementation so you can help real students much more quickly. So we're beginning to think more in our sort of internal language. We're beginning to think more about scale and spread. We'll always be invested in innovation, but right now we see a real opportunity, partly because of the urgency of the problem, partly because of the growing skepticism around college, partly because of the recognition amongst college leaders that they not only have to tackle that skepticism, but they have to do it in a way which will lead to the sustainability of their institutions. Those are all powerful levers. And so the question is, how can we use this moment in time? This window is open, probably not forever. How can we use the fact that this window is open to sort of promulgate the knowledge that the community has developed in a way that helps more students more quickly?
I think that is absolutely huge. And we're using the word skepticism here, but just in terms of the classroom experience, I'm finding that that skepticism is particularly healthy. It shows an awareness of these complex issues that I think when the students come to the university with an understanding of the complex, financial constraints and the system constraints and the support constraints, that is a form of influence that we haven't seen really before. And I know at least our university is trying very hard to wrap their hands around and their heads around an educated customer base in a way that they've never had, and that I think it could be skeptical in sort of a negative context, but it can also be a very powerful motivator.
I think that's right. I think consumer information. Look, I mean, this is America. This is the United States of America, where consumer movements and consumer information movements have been very powerful in a variety of industries, and we can go back to the food industry if we wanted to, and Upton Sinclair. The challenge here, I think, is that the students who's face some of the biggest obstacles have the least voice.
Yeah.
And for a variety of reasons,
right,
are least likely to use that voice.
So the group that has the least voice is growing. So this becomes all of these sort of accommodations and all of these bits of innovation that we're seeing. Are they truly impacting rising access to those who need it the most? The group without a voice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of our biggest challenges. Look, I mean, if you look at this from a sort of through a macro lens, we cannot actually achieve our workforce development needs without doing a heck of a lot better with students who are historically underserved by colleges and universities. It's highly improbable. I mean, bluntly, there's not enough wealthy white people left to educate to meet our workforce development needs. The numbers don't work.
But I tell you, I think most people are wholly unaware of what you're saying here. My sense when I travel the country is that people have their head down; they don't have their head out.
So I think that's right. But I'm gonna again eternal optimist. So 29 states.
You're the impatient optimist.
I'm an impatient optimist. Thank you. 29 states have education goals. 20 of those. I may need to go back and correct the number, but last time I checked, 29 states have education goals, like numeric goals. 20 of those track with the 11 million, which is also the Lumina goal. Like 65% of the adults need to have some form of higher education by 2025. So 20 of the 29 states that have goals, education attainment goals, have goals which track with that, right? So you're beginning to see at least, that's that North Star. That's important for policy as well as institution, right? So you're seeing that North Star now land in public policy in a variety of states, which is a big deal. You're beginning to see states, Oregon, Texas, Tennessee, great example, beginning to formulate their education public policies and statewide strategic planning around that goal, right? So you're beginning to see a level of recognition and policy circles, which I think is really high. You see that on the ground as well. If you look within, spent some time recently with Steve Johnson and his folks at Sinclair Community College in Dayton. I mean, or Johnson C. Smith in Charlotte. They're very acutely aware. They are regional institutions. They're local institutions. They serve a particular community, right? They are acutely aware that their fate and the community's fate are intimately tied together. And are working well within their communities, within their context, in order to meet the goals which are now conceived of on a kind of a more of a local level. So I'm seeing more orientation towards that kind of thinking.
When I'm in the trenches with some institutions, in individual ones, I am working as hard as I can to get them to talk about the elephants in the room that they're not willing to talk about, or it's hard to talk about. And that kind of human behavior of not being candid, not being willing to sort of recognize, here's the things we need to face, that to me is an impediment for us being successful in the long term.
I think that's right. And look, the other bit of good news, again, my impatient optimism, is that higher education tends to attract educated people to work in the industry. So it's not the kind of place that responds well, again, to the leader coming in and saying, we're going to do this, folks. But it is a kind of place where people are sensitive to information and its interpretation. So you can imagine, and I've seen it and participated in great conversations with passionate faculty and advisors and staff, administrators, where you're just, look, here's the problem. Let's look out 15 years. Let's run, let's do some form of scenario. Higher education does this all the time. It's called enrollment planning, right? We've been doing enrollment planning forever. So we're not unused to doing kind of long-range thinking. We do long-range capital development plans forever, right? So we're not unused to long-range thinking. Now, unfortunately, the data that we're looking at are profoundly disturbing. And, there are opportunities to host on campus really good and powerful discussions about the nature, the extent of the challenge that the institution is facing, given the student body and the communities that it serves, and to host really good and vigorous debate in the context of well-evidenced information about what can and cannot be tried and what does and does not work well or better in certain circumstances, about what that institution can and ought to do. We are now in a position to do a kind of strategic planning that is more inclusive, and it will only work, to your point, I think, if folks are able to actively listen, to hear through, to approach issues with an open mind, to recognize, depending on what their age is, that the profession that they signed up for has not changed, but the context in which it is being practiced has transformed itself. And so what does that mean? And those are really hard conversations, but I think they can be actively pursued. And the best leaders, faculty and administrative, are able to facilitate that, to conduct that kind of change leadership very, very effectively. It's hard to do. It's
and
important.
This is all in the context of something else that you shared with us, is this idea that, since the election, and I'm not pointing to the election itself, and I'm not, advocating or talking negative about any politician in this case, but the nature of the public discourse. You talk about microclimates is an area that we need to be paying attention to. How is this coming together and being with like-minded people and feeling safer in a place where you have people that share your point of view? How might that be affecting, as we look forward, the nature of how our institutions create diversity and how we build on that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, one of the things
you raised it. I was really struck by the insight as you look forward a couple of years and saying, are we going to see some impact in how our institutions are effectively creating the diverse population they're looking for in the context of more and more closing down and being able to have public discourse?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most disturbing trends that I see, at least in American society, is this groups of people living amongst, living with, socializing with, thinking with folks who are a lot like themselves. It's increasing segregation. I don't use that in a kind of necessarily in a race way that has racial implications. But that segregation isn't now just about where people live. It's about who they work with. It's about the kinds of news media they engage with, the social media they engage with. It's the political, discourse that they're familiar with. You're seeing increasing separation in our society, and discontent as a result. And we saw that obviously in the election cycle, and it's still and there's no. There seems to me to be no evidence except for that is actually growing. Higher education, not all colleges and universities. It depends on where you're located. I mean, if you're a regional comprehensive in the middle of South or North Dakota, you're not. It's not by definition. It's not going to be a very diverse institution. It may be diverse by income, but certainly not by race. But in other corners, higher education, colleges and universities have really played a vital role as being part of our public square. I mean, they have been one of those institutions which has contributed to the function of the melting pot. And so the question is, does it continue in that role? And if you look at some of the challenges that campuses are facing with respect of the tensions between different groups of students, is that going to translate itself into trends in enrollment that see students enrolling in institutions that they choose because they're likely to be amongst the majority. People like them. They're likely to be with the majority of people are going to be more rather than less like them. And what does that mean? Not just for the nature of the college experience, but the nature of the education, and frankly, the ability to contribute something in the way of breaking down some of the barriers that are growing up to separate
That's
people.
such an important question to be paying attention to. And, it's like also this movement of safe spaces and maybe redefining. My hope is, and to the extent that we can have influence on this, that the concept of safe spaces really morphs more back into a safe space to be able to listen and engage with each other and different points of view. That's what higher education was.
Truly. And it reminds us where, for me as a faculty member, it reminds me that we're not done. If they just graduate and they leave with all the content that was in my head, we're still not done. Where does this discussion impact me in the classroom? Because I think it does, and I believe it does.
Which leads to a conversation that maybe we can have another time, Dan, which is this idea of how education needs to move from being more than just knowledge acquisition, but the focus on learning to learn.
Right.
As students graduate, are we preparing them for what they're going to encounter as learners in the world, right? I think that's a whole other domain. Where would you like people to go and learn more about either your work or the work of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation?
It's a great question, and thank you for that, and thank you for asking. So we have a website, which is postsecondary.gatesfoundation.org, and from the website you can also find our newsletter, which I think we get out, 10 or so times a year, and just subscribe. It's free and get sent. It'll come along when it's prepared. So that'll take care of the foundation. From the site, there are all sorts of links to partners and to the great works that our partners are doing, and I think that's the real jewel or gem. It's not the work of the foundation so much as the work of the great people that we're able to travel in their company, which is super important. I would add one thing just to that last point that you made, if I can, and that is just to remind us all that higher education is not a single monolithic thing. It has many different purposes for many different kinds of students. And so as we begin to sort of debate and discuss the trajectory of higher education, I think it will do well to remember the diversity of approaches and the diversity of need, and that the thing that works well for a student in pursuing a liberal arts education at a smallish college may not be the thing that works so well for an adult who is returning to education after some hiatus with a view to improving their standing in the job market, which is different yet again than a student, potentially different yet again from a student coming as a first person in their family to go to college, directly from high school, potentially lacking some of the social and even academic capital that they might trigger their automatic success. That the experiences of these students and the needs of these students are very different. And so we need always to ask ourselves, when we're talking about education, what kind of education are we talking about for whom? And then how do we tailor the knowledge about what works and what doesn't to those very different approaches and needs? And so I just wanted to close with that to remind us that we're dealing with a complex entity, which is sort of defies, and it's one of the reasons it moves slowly, it defies, sort of silver bullet approach to transformation, which is a good thing. I think it's one of our great strengths.
A perfect set of words with which to end our conversation. Dr. Dan Greenstein, thank you so much for joining us from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
On behalf of Dan and Howard Teibel, I'm Pete Wright. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll catch you next time right here on Navigating Change, the podcast from Teibel Education.